It is now time for our weekly political segment, Texas Face Off. Joining me this morning is Tara Pohlmeyer, Communications Manager with Progress Texas, and Matt McCoviak, Chairman of the Travis County Republican Party. Thank you both for being here with us today.
Thank you.
You know, as we gear up and start talking about election season, a lot of times we're hearing people talk about redistricting and gerrymandering. There was a decision that came down from a three-court panel saying that Texas did not need federal oversight in approving its maps. Can't get my words out. Matt, it's because I'm coming to you first, so I'm saying your name. You know, Republicans see this as a win. Talk to me about why.
Well, I mean, redistricting should be the sole responsibility of a state legislature. Why, a judge somewhere should be able to render their opinion on whether a map is appropriate or not, I think is not appropriate. Unless there's a just decades-long history of racial motivations in terms of redistricting. I know Democrats would argue that happened in the last decade in Texas, but there really hasn't been a consistent racial motivation in Texas to try to disenfranchise voters. Just hasn't been there over history. Look, I think redistricting ought to be something where local elected officials, state reps, and state senators are ultimately held accountable by the voters. Given the importance of this election cycle, because it's going to determine who the members are that represent each district going into redistricting, that the map is going to be in place for the next 10 years. There will be legal challenges. There always are. But this is an important election cycle, and I think it's a very good thing that we don't have to go through Justice Department preclearance for the new map, and that the legislature, whoever it is, can ultimately be the ones to decide.
Tara, the Democrats would disagree and say Texas has a history of this and could use some oversight.
Absolutely. I would completely agree with you, and I think Matt is kind of glossing over some of our Texas history here, in that Texas has a history of suppressing the right to vote, and specifically with communities of color. I think a lot of what we're seeing here and a lot of what we've seen recently from Supreme Court decisions on gerrymandering is that a lot of times this is disguised as partisan gerrymandering, but it actually is racial gerrymandering. And so I do agree that Texas needs some oversight. Even though we're a battleground state for 2020, we do see gerrymandering and these Republican-led redistricting processes continue to skew our political representation. And so overall, we want Texans to choose our politicians. We don't want politicians to get to choose their Texans.
You know, we say that, and I think it's interesting. We can remember some decades ago when the Democrats were in control of the Texas legislature, and one might say they gerrymandered and drew the maps to ensure that they would stay in power. Is this just something that happens in politics when you allow politicians to draw the maps?
I think so, yes, and I think gerrymandering across the board is bad and should not be happening, and I would really recommend that the state looks into a bipartisan, citizen-led community effort, committee effort to redistrict and not give this over to the hands of lawmakers who, have some priorities when they're drawing these maps.
Matt, doesn't everyone have priorities when they're drawing maps, though?
Sure, and I would argue that the California congressional map, which is drawn entirely by Democrats, is a gerrymandered map. Look, so the party that's in power always looks to try to get something of an advantage. There are limitations, though, right? We have requirements in terms of minority-performing districts. You can only work with districts, based on who the incumbent is, right? So, for example, if South Texas on the congressional side was a blue area entirely, Republicans have no ability to break in there and try to create a Republican district. Changing one district affects all the districts that touch that district. I have to correct one thing. I think it's unfair to say that the state of Texas, quote, suppresses the vote. I would love to know what example she would want to point to in that regard. There were Chicken Little predictions about voter ID, about how it was going to be a disaster for the state before we passed it. There have been almost no problems whatsoever. It's been in place now for, I think, more than 2 years. We have 3 weeks of early voting. You can vote by mail. The idea that Texas suppresses the vote of anyone is absolutely ridiculous.
All right, well, Tara, what would you say to that?
I would recommend that we go back to the history books a little bit here, in that white women in particular have only had the right to vote for about 100 years, and even fewer times than that, black and brown women have not had that right to vote. And so now that we do have the right to vote, things like voter ID, things like not allowing a student ID to be a form of voter ID, are ways that people suppress the right to vote.
But wouldn't we say that that women couldn't vote across the country. That wasn't
Absolutely.
just a Texas thing.
Absolutely, yes. And so we have a lot of work to do across the country, not just here in Texas.
All right. Let's switch gears and talk a little bit about what we're going to see tonight. Obviously, the second round of Democratic debates. Tara, what do you think Democrats will be looking at when they look at the debates tonight and tomorrow?
Absolutely. I think tonight we are looking at kind of like that sparring that we'll see between Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and what we expect from them. I do think that we'll see some differences play out there. And tomorrow night, I am personally looking forward to seeing Kamala Harris and Cory Booker take on Joe Biden and kind of challenge him on some of his historical decisions that he's made.
You know, Matt, are Republicans looking to see if these Democrats are just going to keep tearing each other down on their, I mean, does that work well for the Republican Party?
It does. I mean, I think that look, you have 20 different people that are debating over the next 2 nights. I think I saw an analysis earlier this morning that said 12 of them, as of right now, would not qualify for the next round of debates beginning in September because the thresholds double,
right,
both in terms of donors and polling. So you're going to see, I think, some fairly desperate people over the next 2 nights. You know, if you look at Kamala Harris, she gained notoriety and fundraising and support by attacking Joe Biden. I think you're going to see others do that. But you're right. I mean, I think that the more that they attack each other, the more fractured and divided the Democratic Party becomes. I think the other thing to watch is, you know, do they continue to take positions that are well outside the mainstream of the country, whether it's providing health care to illegal immigrants, decriminalizing illegal entry into the country, eliminating private insurance. It would affect 180 million Americans. These are litmus test positions that the bulk of their first-tier candidates are taking that are going to be a huge problem in the general election, and that's going to benefit Trump for his reelection.
Yeah, definitely going to be interesting. Do you feel like that this is hurting Democrats by everybody picking everyone apart?
You know, I think we are moving in a certain direction as a Democratic Party, and I do think that we're seeing those differences play out. And so I know that Texans are looking forward to seeing these candidates talk about health care, talk about abortion access, talk about voting rights. And Texans have tripled their donations to Democratic presidential candidates compared to 4 years ago. So we're really excited to see what plays out tonight.
All right. Well, we certainly all will be watching, and we thank you both for joining us today. Of course, if you guys missed any of this, you can head on over to KVUE.com right after the newscast to rewatch Texas Face Off. We'll be right back.